In the high-stakes race to write the rulebook for global climate reporting, everyone was watching two giants, the European Union and the United States. But in a pretty shocking turn of events, a totally different player kind of came out of nowhere from the world of accounting, of all places, to set the new global standard. So how on earth did a group of accountants outmaneuver the world's biggest superpowers? Let's get into it.
It all boils down to one simple question, but the stakes, they could not be higher. Who actually gets to write the rules for how corporations report their impact on the climate? A single global standard? Well, that promised to bring some much-needed clarity for investors and, frankly, some real accountability for companies. The race to create it was officially on.
You see, before this race really kicked off, the situation was just a chaotic mess. You had this alphabet soup of voluntary standards, GRI, CDP, SASB, all with slightly different rules and definitions. For an investor, trying to compare companies apples to apples was, well, it was nearly impossible. And for the companies, this patchwork system created loopholes big enough to drive a truck through, making it way too easy to hide their true environmental impact.
So, who is everyone betting on to clean up this mess? Well, all eyes were on two global superpowers. First, you had the European Union. They're famous for what's called the Brussels effect, basically flexing their huge market power to make their strict regulations the global norm. And then, of course, there was the United States, home to the world's biggest financial markets and the incredibly powerful Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. These two were the undisputed heavyweights in the ring.
Okay, so a race to set rules. But why was this so urgent? Why was this such a big deal? It's because the world wasn't just looking for another standard. It was looking for the standard, a single, mandatory set of rules that would apply to everybody.
The number one problem that needed solving was greenwashing. This is the whole game of companies cherry-picking their environmental wins while, conveniently hiding the losses. Without clear, mandatory rules, it was just too easy for a company to paint a misleadingly green picture of itself. Regulators and investors were getting really fed up with the smoke and mirrors. They wanted real, verifiable data. A global standard was meant to achieve a few really key things. It would give investors the transparency they desperately needed, it would directly fight greenwashing, and it would create a level playing field for all companies. But maybe most importantly, it would help the entire financial system finally start to accurately price the massive risks that come with climate change.
Early on, let's be honest, the smart money was on the EU. Their comprehensive new rules, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, were incredibly far-reaching. They didn't just apply to companies in the EU, they applied to any major company doing business there. This is that Brussels effect in action, the idea that the EU's market is so huge, the rest of the world would just have to fall in line and adopt its standards.
But just as the EU and the US were getting ready to take control, the whole script got flipped. Both of these frontrunners started to face some serious headwinds as political and economic pressure threatened to completely derail their ambitious plans. The pushback was swift, and it was fierce. All across Europe and the US, a chorus of companies and industry groups started sounding the alarm. They argued that the proposed rules were a bureaucratic nightmare, way too complex, way too expensive, with compliance costs that were, in their words, disproportionate. The message was loud and clear. This is too much, too soon.
And you know what? That pushback worked. Facing this immense pressure, both frontrunners blinked. The EU hit the brakes, delaying its most detailed, sector-specific standards. Over in the US, the SEC first watered down its proposed rule and then ultimately just abandoned its defense of it in court. And just like that, the two giants had stumbled, leaving this massive leadership vacuum right in the middle of the global stage.
So with the superpowers sitting on the sidelines, the stage was set for an unlikely hero to emerge. A new player stepped onto the field, and they came from a very, very unexpected corner of the financial world.
Okay, so if the regulators in Brussels and Washington couldn't get it done, who could? Who had the credibility and the global reach to fill this enormous void? The answer was the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. Now, you might not have heard of them, but I bet you've heard of their parent organization, the IFRS Foundation. These are the folks who set the international accounting standards that companies in over 140 countries use. They're basically the architects of the global financial language, and that gave them a huge advantage. And the ISSB moved with incredible speed. It didn't start from scratch. It was announced in late 2021, and it quickly went about absorbing some of the most respected private sector standards bodies that companies are already using. This was a genius move. It gave them instant momentum and credibility. By the middle of 2023, they had already published their first global standards. It was honestly a masterclass in strategic consolidation.
So, how did they pull this off? How did a relatively unknown accounting body succeed where the world's biggest economic powers had stumbled? Well, the secret to their success was a winning formula built on one thing: pragmatism. Their playbook was simple, but brilliant. It really came down to 3 key steps. First, they kept their focus laser sharp, only on information that directly affects a company's financial value for investors. That's it. Second, they didn't try to reinvent the wheel. Instead, they built upon the private standards that global markets were already comfortable with. And third, they leveraged the immense global trust and infrastructure of their parent organization, the IFRS Foundation.
Okay, now, the single biggest difference in their approach comes down to this concept called materiality. The ISSB went with what's known as single materiality. It asks just one question: how do climate issues affect the company's bottom line? Simple. The EU, on the other hand, aimed for double materiality, which asks that same question plus a second, much broader one. How does the company's activity affect the planet and society? The ISSB's narrower, less costly approach ended up being way more appealing to a global audience.
So, why was this pragmatic formula so successful? Well, for one, it was seen as neutral and technical, not political. It kept costs down for businesses, which got rid of a lot of the resistance. It was built on frameworks that big investors already knew and trusted. And for regulators all around the world, the ISSB basically offered a credible, off-the-shelf solution that they could just plug and play.
So here we are. The ISSB's pragmatic approach has effectively made it the new global standard. But to really understand what this all means, we need to look at both its incredible impact and its very real limitations. The impact of the ISSB's rise has been, well, it's been staggering. We're talking about jurisdictions that represent over half of the entire global economy that have already committed to adopting or aligning their rules with the ISSB standards. This is a level of global convergence that has happened at a speed that I think has caught almost everyone by surprise.
And look, this isn't just talk. A wave of major economies is already moving to make these standards mandatory. We're talking about places like the United Kingdom, Brazil, Australia, Japan, and dozens of others. They are actively writing the ISSB's playbook into their national laws.
But, and this is a really big but, the ISSB system isn't perfect. Not by a long shot. First off, it has no enforcement power. Countries have to voluntarily adopt and then enforce these rules themselves. Second, that narrow investor focus means a company's broader impact on the environment might not be fully captured. And finally, as countries adopt these rules, they can tweak them, which risks creating the very same fragmentation the whole system was designed to fix.
And this really brings us to the central trade-off at the heart of this entire story. The ISSB standard, it may not be the most comprehensive or ambitious one we could imagine, but it is the one the world is actually embracing. So what do you think? Is a single, pragmatic, global rule that actually gets adopted better than a perfect one that just remains on the shelf? That's the fundamental question that's going to shape the future of climate accountability. Thanks for watching.